Hello and welcome to the audio recording of the book Tarona's Ghostly Encounters. These are accounts of real situations which occurred while Tarona was working as a paranormal investigator. So hold on to your seats.
Chapter 1. The pub ghost that terrified a Rottweiler. Ghostly goings-on in a young couple's home. Terrified spirit children at an old vicarage. Woman possessed by a negative entity. Tales of ghosts and strange paranormal phenomena have fascinated people throughout the centuries. Sightings of these mysterious beings seem to be a perfectly natural occurrence. It is in fact believed that 1 out of every 10 people will see a ghost during their lifetime. Ghosts can often appear solid and lifelike. They may also cast a shadow. Often it's only when they have vanished that people realise they have actually had an encounter. They can leave smells, sometimes beautiful perfume, sometimes disgusting odours, depending on the entity's character. Not all ghosts are malevolent, and not all ghosts are ghosts. Many of these spirits are nothing more than earth energies, thought forms, or just simple recordings. Through my work as a clairvoyant and ghost investigator, I have witnessed many paranormal encounters, some perfectly harmless and some pure evil. I will go into many different types of hauntings throughout this book. People often forget that ghosts are individual, just like you and I. They should always be treated with great respect. Some of these spirits belong to centuries long past. Some come from more recent times. But the biggest question to be answered is, why do ghosts haunt? Well, let's look into this point. Evidence seems to show some beings find it harder to rid themselves of their old earthly self after death. This could be the case if a person was murdered, or if they entered death feeling guilty, betrayed, or restless. Some entities just do not know they have passed from the physical plane and therefore become lost. First of all, let us try to understand what takes place after death by looking at the near-death experiences of others. Since 1960, a lot of research has been carried out into the experiences of those who were pronounced clinically dead. Many of these death experiences occurred on the operating table, and it was these people who reported their survival when they were brought back to life. Most of the people spoke of very similar experiences, even though some of them had previously not believed in life after death. All had been aware they had left their bodies and remembered passing through a tunnel or seeing a light shining at the other end. When they passed through the tunnel into a brilliant light, someone had always been there to meet them. Often it was a dead friend or relative. The feeling of peace and happiness when moving into the light filled them with so much joy that most of the people admitted to being reluctant to return into their bodies. So, if after death, for whatever reason, we were unable or unwilling to go through this tunnel towards the light, we would be trapped here, without our physical body, becoming a lost spirit or ghost. You are about to hear stories about Leicestershire ghost. On many of these investigations, I was accompanied by either a reporter or a paranormal investigator to give a balanced viewpoint. Let me start with my first investigation into Leicestershire ghost. It was St Valentine's Day, February the 14th, 1992. I had been booked for a promotion that evening at the Crow's Nest Public House on King Richard's Road in Leicester. This was to be the first of many visits to this friendly public house. I was asked to join the Valentine's Night promotion and make it a fun evening for the regulars by giving a few light-hearted card readings. After parking our car, both my husband and I made our way to the main entrance. This would have been at around 5:45 on the Sunday evening. Greeting us at the door was the friendly face of Kevin the landlord, together with his two massive Rottweiler dogs. Kevin made us most welcome and invited us in. He pointed over to the corner of the main lounge, asking me if this spot would be a good place to work in. Perfect, I told him, because it was nice and private, just what I needed to ensure confidentiality to my clients. Soon tarot cards and crystals decorated the covered wooden table. My area was a mass of palm charts and leaflets explaining what was on offer to them this evening. After we finished our display, the landlord asked if we would like a hot drink or something stronger. Declining the something stronger, we settled for a cup of tea. Kevin went into the kitchen to make it for us. As we sat and drank tea and chatted away, the conversation soon turned to pets. Kevin went into great detail about his two Rottweilers, a pet snake and a tarantula spider. My husband had always been interested in snakes and took up Kevin's offer to view them in the flat upstairs. I declined, having never been a fan of snakes or spiders myself. I continued drinking my tea, accompanied by the landlord's dogs. They sat firmly either side of me, staring into space. This did make me a little nervous, admittedly, but it was still better than the other option, or so I thought. The landlord and my husband could not have been gone for longer than 3 minutes when Magnum, the larger of the two dogs, started to growl. Noticing its hair standing up on the back of its neck, I was terrified. What had I done? My mind raced ahead. Should I scream out? If I did, would this excite them even more? Should I just remain still? To my complete astonishment, Magnum started to take a step forward. He was frantic, growling at what appeared to be thin air. My gaze was fixed firmly upon him, following his every move. Suddenly, without warning, a grey swirling mist appeared that transformed itself into the shape and form of a woman. I was frozen to the spot, more afraid of the dog than the spirit, and my eyes watched while the ghostly woman glided in slow motion across the floor, past the dog and right past me. Her head was held down. She seemed to be searching, desperately looking for something, while gliding past my table and out of the window next to it. Adrenaline flowing, I leapt out of my seat, dashing over to the window where Magnum was already standing. We stood frozen to the spot and could do no more than watch this ghost hovering near the road. She then disappeared like steam from a kettle. Magnum was barking loudly, and soon the landlord and my husband returned to see us standing by the window. Explaining what had happened, I half expected the landlord to laugh, but he did not. Soon afterwards, Kevin and his wife Jeannie were telling me of how Magnum often growled at thin air and attacked stools over in the corner. This was the same corner the ghost had appeared from. Up until recently, Jeannie, who admitted to always having been a little sceptical, had to believe when things started happening to her. The phenomena she described usually took place after closing time on Saturdays. I usually stay up very late because of the Sunday lunch preparations. It's around 4 a.m. when a draft tends to brush past my skin, and this is in a room with no windows or doors open, she insisted. On some occasions I'll see a light flash behind me. I try to explain it to myself, saying it's headlights from the dual carriageway, but at that time of the morning there is no traffic. When this happens, it's exit left and straight back into the kitchen for me. Of the two Rottweilers, Zoltan and Magnum, it seems Magnum is the one who appears to sense the ghostly presences. The evening went without further sightings. A year passed, and Jeannie asked me if I could go over to see her because there had been another development concerning the ghost and she was worried about it. On arrival, she told me a young mother had stopped her recently to tell her about the pub being covered in a mist some mornings. The woman insisted her 3-year-old son had told her he was running to a lady who was waving to him. The child's mother had not seen any woman waving to her son. Her concern was the main road he had to run across, as she feared he could have been killed. So could this ghost be searching for a child, I wonder? Could it be malevolent? Trying to entice the child across a busy road could prove fatal. Finding out more about the land the pub was built on was my next objective. Apparently the Crow's Nest stands on a very old site. It used to be full of terraced houses that were close to water supplies. My feeling was that this ghost had either lost a child through drowning or had been involved in the child's death. Either way, it could not rest from its eternal search. I was all prepared to investigate further, but sadly Jeannie died tragically and Kevin left the pub several weeks later. I've never been back to the Crow's Nest since, so does this ghost still haunt? Before Jeannie's death, a Leicester newspaper featured her story about the ghost at the pub. From this news report came a phone call from a couple who lived in the village on the outskirts of Leicester. They claimed their home was haunted and asked if I would go over and investigate. It was arranged for me to visit the couple's home on the following Saturday. I found that they were a professional couple who didn't scare easily. Ray was an undertaker and his wife Sarah was a nurse in charge of mentally ill patients. The couple's bungalow was around 15 to 20-year-old, and although modern in design, it had an uneasy feeling when I entered it. The young couple had only been married a year, and since they had moved into the bungalow, strange happenings had taken place. Sarah told me she could often feel herself being watched. She was aware of another pair of eyes looking at her. At first she put this down to imagination, but soon ghostly figures started appearing throughout this bungalow, and Ray had admitted to seeing things. Bottles would float into the air. They were full ones, she quipped, trying to make light of the situation. Then animals such as cats and dogs would materialize. My own dog would howl like crazy near the back bedroom door. He refused to stay in that room. He takes off these days, she added. Walking out of the lounge and down the corridor, I stopped outside the back bedroom door. There were definitely cold spots, and immediately I could feel a presence. Soon the sensation of being hanged came through to me. I could feel that this ghost was gentle, and he meant me no harm. All he wished to do was to enlighten me. As he gently hoisted me up, my head felt heavy. It was then I could feel him turn my head to the left. I knew this spirit was a monk who had died slowly and painfully. He seemed to be almost shy, afraid to move on into the next world for some reason. The feeling he had committed some shameful deed seemed to bind him to this spot. Opening the back bedroom door, I could feel two ghostly presences and the spirit of a dog. Suddenly rail tracks and an old hut were seen through my mind's eye. I asked Sarah if she knew where the trains used to go across the land. She replied that there had been trains many years ago and the tracks had run at the bottom of her garden. The ghostly figures in front of me stood silently and afraid, trying to hide. Calming them down was not easy, it took time. One of them, a man, had been in his late 20s and was on drugs when he died. Impressing the letters LSD on me telepathically, he let me know these drugs had made him crazy. He had hallucinated when walking onto the train track with his dog, believing he was powerful enough to stop an oncoming train. The other entity was an elderly woman who had been an alcoholic. She was confused and did not know for sure if she had run out deliberately onto the track. The train track preview shown to me earlier turned out to be the rails that had existed up until the 1960s. Strange as it may sound, when helping a spirit to move on, it is important to talk to them and acknowledge their presence. Anyone who suspects they have a ghost in the house should do the same. It might be hard to believe, but many spirits are more frightened of us than we are of them. When trying to help a lost entity return to the light, it is important to appeal to their emotions. For example, tell the spirit a loved one is waiting in the next world for them. If you suspect they have no family, then ask if they have any pets. Explore all avenues. After a while, the atmosphere changes, and on many occasions a ray of light can be seen or just the feeling of warmth entering the room. This indicates someone from the spirit world has come through for them. So a little friendly coaxing goes a long way to enable them to move into the light. Many years ago, I used to worry about the ghost I had not been able to move on, and thought they would be left roaming for evermore. But this is not the case. There are many helpers from the spirit dimensions all ready to show the way forward to these earthbound spirits. Like everything else, it's all to do with timing, and maybe the people who see ghosts are meant to have that experience. As they say, seeing is believing. After clearing the lost entities by the very methods I've just mentioned, I went home. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived thanking me for my help. Apparently, the bungalow appeared to be free from the former ghost, and thankfully the couple's dog was now unafraid. This is just one of the many cases I've investigated in which I have found land to be haunted rather than the actual building. The contents of the letter sent are, as I will read out to you. Dear Tarona, we are writing to thank you for moving on our resident ghost. Up until you came on Saturday, February the 26th, we were being followed about the bungalow, which was cold, especially in the back bedroom. Objects would be moved around and the dog would be very nervous and clingy towards us. Now the whole bungalow is a lot warmer and no more objects have been moved around. There have been no sightings of any of our spirit lodgers and the bungalow seems a lot more content and happier. We have since found out that there was a monastery nearby and a monastery retreat even nearer, many hundreds of years ago. After doing a bit of research into the different orders, we have found that all monks breaking the law were hanged and buried with their head turned to the left, a sign of disgrace. They were buried outside of the monastery grounds. Our lives are peaceful now and the bungalow even appears to be different. Thanks again for helping us and thanks for helping the ghost to move onwards. Gratefully yours, Ray and Sarah. Another classic sign of ghost are cold spots in certain rooms. Even well-heated rooms will always have a big drop in temperature compared to other rooms in the home. Sometimes ghosts try to warn us of things and really do not mean to frighten us at all. But even the best made plans go wrong sometimes, as in this next investigation. I received a phone call from social services asking for my help in connecting with a haunted house for battered women. The home's identity must be kept secret for obvious reasons, but let's say it is somewhere in the Midlands. Sue, the social worker, came to fetch me the following Tuesday morning, dressed in old faded jeans and baggy t-shirt. Soon she started opening up to me, telling me some of the things that had happened since we spoke on the telephone. It's got worse. I'm afraid to be on my own in this house, she confessed, shuddering. After last night, we are all at our wits' end. In fact, some of the women are thinking of returning to the very homes they fled from. Anyway, she continued, a young boy had a terrifying experience the night before. Dean, not his real name, is only 11 and very streetwise. Nothing scares this boy, nothing, until last night, that is. What happened to him, I asked. He was washing up in the kitchen when a mop came flying through the air. He turned around and saw a grey figure moving close to him. He screamed in terror and ran out of the refuge, and he will not come back again. She told me that all the women were panic-stricken. Do you know if the boy's all right? I inquired. Yes, he's staying with relatives, but his mother is still here. Would you like to talk with her? Sue asked. Dean's mother looked troubled, and it was obvious she had not slept the previous night. Sue rang through to where Dean was staying and called me to the telephone. Tell me what happened, Dean, I asked, trying to assure the boy that everything would be all right eventually. He went into detail about the cold hand on his shoulder, and his voice was shaking with fear as he told me about the floor mop flying by itself through the air. Set back from the road, this former vicarage gives no hint that the house is victims of violence. It's so important this does not find its way into the press, Sue said. For the sake of the women and children, it's imperative the location of the refuge remains secret. I reassured her the editor who had given her my number could be trusted. Asking her if she had seen anything unusual herself, she nodded. This is why I phoned you last week and asked you to come over. Strange things have been happening since we moved in, she explained. This refuge has only been open 6 months, and if things carry on like they have been doing, the social service will have it closed down. I asked her to tell me if she had experienced any supernatural happenings. She said that 2 weeks previously, the cleaner and herself had stood in the children's play area when noises could be heard upstairs. Admitting to be afraid, she asked the cleaner to go with her while she inspected the upstairs rooms. After an intensive search throughout the rooms, nothing could be found, so they went back inside the playroom. To their absolute disbelief, all the furniture had been moved around. Trying to make a joke of it, the cleaner suggested the ghost could vacuum the room as well if they wished. Following Sue's directions, I walked into the playroom and could feel a ghostly chill around me. Telepathically, this spirit showed itself to me. It was a woman wearing a high-necked blouse, the kind popular in England in the Victorian era. A long grey skirt fitted over her slim silhouette. The ghost would have been typically middle class. The feeling she had murdered a baby came to me. Soon a spirit child could be felt tugging at the bottom of my long red skirt. Doom and despair shrouded this room. Sinister happenings had taken place there. As I moved into the kitchen, more spirit children gathered around me. One of these children told me her name was Elizabeth. The ghost children had not intended to frighten the boy or the woman in the house. They had only wanted to warn them of the clergyman. These spirit children were aware that their new occupants had known cruelty and violence just like themselves. Moving up the long, old-fashioned winding corridors, I went into the upstairs bedroom. To the right of a large Victorian window it stood, dark and menacing. It was the ghost of an old vicar. I had encountered many ghosts in the course of my work, each one giving off a different feeling. This one was particularly mean and cruel, and was the man the children were afraid of. I understood now why these spirit children were so terrified. He gave me the most evil of looks before he vanished. I returned downstairs after thoroughly inspecting the upstairs rooms and cupboards. Soon my communication continued with the spirit children. They told me how they had been subject to pain and cruelty, hurt and humiliation, and forced to eat gruel even though it made one of them physically sick. All of them were terrified of the graveyard, saying a baby had been buried alive. Their tales of horror and abuse mortified me. My heart went out to these poor little souls. Before leaving, I did what I always do and asked for the help from the spirit world. A magazine editor was present during this interview, and he interviewed Sue, the social worker, afterwards. This is what Sue had to say in her own words. We were desperate for something to be done, for some help to be given. It had been a cumulative effect of various incidents over this time, and I had reached the point where I had to do something. After speaking to Tarona the first time, I realised that ghostly activity can actually increase if people are frightened, and there were a lot of very frightened people here. The local vicar had been in twice to bless the rooms and hand out Bibles for free, but nothing had happened to stop these incidents from occurring. In fact, the activity had been increasing since he came to the house. This refuge is not part of the church. The house was sold to social services a few years ago. Following my investigation at the refuge, further information came to light. Sue did a little background research and found the old vicarage had been used as a school many years previously. The clergy were teachers and they ran the school from around 1800 to 1860. It was also discovered that a murder had taken place in the house, and an old gentleman confirmed this. One of the clergy who lived in the house long ago had hung or poisoned himself. Sue herself had experienced many incidents, including one involving a shower room door. The handle half turned from the inside, and then the door was flung wide open by an invisible force. There was no way it could have opened from the outside. This was witnessed by several different people. There had been many ghostly figures seen laying on sofas and walking down the passageways, and especially in the children's playroom. The house had been full of nasty vibes, and thankfully all is now at peace. In this next story, you will see why some negative entities are able to feed off others. Sadly, I was not able to help the woman concerned free herself of possession. The place was somewhere in the Midlands. I arrived to find a normal-looking house. After I knocked on the door, I thought of a phone call I had received that morning asking me to go there on what turned out to be a cold winter's afternoon. The door was opened by a woman in her late 20s. She was casually but smartly dressed in trousers and sweater. After I had introduced myself, she invited me inside. To protect my client's identity, we will call her Viv. Viv led the way into the lounge, and the cold winter sunlight came through the old sash-cord window. She introduced me to Sally. Again, her name had been changed. Her lesbian lover looked drained. Viv began to tell me of how she was constantly groped by what appeared to be a ghost. Viv would be washing up at the kitchen sink or dusting a room when an invisible hand would start to touch her in intimate places. At first she laughed it off, thinking it was her partner, but after inspecting the room she would find herself completely alone. Because Sally worked shifts at a local hospital, this meant that once in every 3 weeks she would be on her own all night. The last time it touched me was yesterday. It must have been close to 11 p.m. when I went to bed. Feeling sleepy after watching the television, I must have fallen asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. The following morning, on awakening, I could feel what I thought was Sally's body snuggled into mine. I turned around to ask why she was home so early, and I found that I was lying next to an invisible force. Again, it started to grope my body. Leaping about 20 feet out of bed, I ran outside into the garden. I stayed there until Sally came home, feeling far too scared to go back indoors alone. When Viv finished speaking, she asked if it was possible for me to inspect each room. After going from one room to the other, it was apparent to me the ghost was not haunting the house, but Viv herself. Within Viv's aura, I could make out the grey presence of an old man. The human aura is an electromagnetic field that surrounds us. The average aura extends by up to a metre from the body. It looks like a slowly swirling collection of tinted clouds that move around our physical being. But in Viv's case, another presence was attached to hers. This was not a nice feeling with him. Worse still, the most vile smell seemed to take over the room. Fighting back the feeling of nausea, I tried to communicate with it. The entity was not going to offer me much information. But one thing I did learn was that it was Viv's grandfather. She looked terrified when I told her who it was, and this puzzled me. "He still will not leave me alone," she cried. She went on to tell me she had been sexually abused when she was a child. Viv nearly hit me when I suggested she should forgive him and maybe then he would move on. "No way," she insisted. "Never. Not after what he's done to me." So was it the hate that kept him earthbound? I wonder. Asking Viv once again to imagine her grandfather bathed in a golden light also turned out to be a waste of time. There was no way she could do this. Sadly, there was no more that I could do to help her. My suggestion that she should get some professional counselling concerning this matter also fell on deaf ears. One thing I'm sure of, though, is that if Viv could see forgiveness in the same light as revenge, she would rid herself of this entity for good. As I have said many times, fear gives power to these negative spirits, and so does hate.